I'm Jack Worth. I'm the lead economist at NFER, and I lead our work on the school workforce. It's been my pleasure to work on this project for the last 18 months, and I'm delighted to tell you all about it today. So, as the various introductions have all touched on, England's teaching workforce is facing a perfect storm that's been gathering for several years. It's characterised by rising pupil numbers and a relatively strong graduate labour market, which makes recruitment and retention challenging. Rapidly rising pupil numbers in secondary schools over the next decade mean that the secondary school system needs more teachers each year. The system needs to increase teacher recruitment to meet this challenge, but the number of secondary recruits to teacher training has been below the target set by the department for 5 years in a row. Retaining teachers in the profession is just as important. Every teacher successfully retained is another teacher we don't have to train to meet that growing demand. Retention also builds the system's capacity for high quality teaching, as inexperience is one of the few factors that we know is most strongly related to teaching quality and to pupil outcomes. However, the number of working age teachers leaving the profession has increased since 2010, which has made it more difficult to maintain supply at the desired level. The number of teachers moving school each year, it's the green bars, has also increased markedly since 2010, doubling in primary and secondary schools. This means that school leaders have more vacancies to fill each year, more staffing uncertainty to deal with, and higher costs of recruiting replacements. The implications of recruitment and retention problems for the system are stark, including lower quality teaching affecting educational standards, and also a greater load being placed on the existing teacher workforce. Supply pressures are most keenly felt in most challenging schools and in geographical areas that struggle with recruitment and retention at the best of times. So teacher supply also has important implications for educational equity and social mobility in England. Given this background, our research set out to explore the factors associated with teacher workforce dynamics, looking at the teacher retention, turnover, and teachers returning to the profession. We're extremely grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this research and agreeing with us that at the time it was and remains an area that needs more research. Our approach has been largely quantitative, combining insights and analysis from a range of data sets to provide a rich picture of the teacher labour market. The findings are presented by theme, including the role played by teachers' characteristics, their pay and conditions, school-level factors, and also geography. A key data set that we used in this project is the school workforce census. In England, we are blessed with administrative data on the education system that is really world-leading, and the school workforce census is no exception. We're very grateful to the Department for Education for sharing this data with us, which enabled our research. So we use the school workforce data to identify the teacher, school, and geographical characteristics that are associated with teacher retention and turnover. However, while the school workforce census collects data on every teacher in England and each school they teach in over a 7-year period, it also has important limitations. It can't tell us what happens next to teachers after they leave the profession. It also doesn't collect data on important factors such as teachers' working hours, their job satisfaction, and their well-being. So we also use data from the Understanding Society survey, a large-scale longitudinal household panel survey, which is run by the University of Essex. The survey provides a rich set of data on individuals and also allows us to track teachers for several years after they leave the profession to see what they do next and what that can tell us about their motivations for leaving. It collects all this information for other professions as well, meaning we can use it to compare teachers' lot with that of other professionals to get some perspective. In this project, we compare teachers with nurses and police officers, large public sector professions facing somewhat similar challenges. We followed our analysis up with conversations with stakeholders in the nursing and policing sectors to see what the education sector might learn from their approaches to staff retention. What we have produced is a diagnostic analysis of teacher workforce dynamics to assist policymakers and system leaders with formulating effective responses to the teacher supply issues that the system faces. We're delighted to be publishing our final report and sharing the key findings with you today. So, what did we find? As I explained, there is a national teacher supply challenge, but it affects different parts of the education system and parts of the teacher workforce very differently. The number of primary teachers has generally kept pace with the increase in pupil numbers over the last decade. The current and future challenge is most acute in the secondary sector. Secondary is where recruitment has been weakest compared to target historically, and where the recruitment targets are made especially challenging because they are subject specific. In other words, it matters whether a trainee is a physics teacher or a PE teacher. The rate of leaving the profession is also higher among secondary teachers. Within secondary schools, there are some important differences in retention rates between teachers of different subjects. DFE published some new data on this last month, which isn't in our report, but confirms what we found in our first research update, which was published in May last year, that early career retention rates are below average for maths, science, and particularly MFL teachers. Early career retention rates for English, history, and geography teachers have been relatively high compared to those other subjects. EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, and the way that EBAC is embedded within the main Progress 8 accountability measure for secondary schools means that schools do have an incentive to increase teaching time for these subjects over the next 5 years. But they have not. Science teacher time per pupil has been flat, and MFL teaching time per pupil is now below where it was in 2010. The lack of growth in curriculum time is likely to be due, at least in part, to reduced teacher supply, constraining schools from expanding provision in these subjects. Meanwhile, teaching time in history and geography, subjects in which recruitment has been relatively strong and retention rates relatively high, has increased since 2010 in response to the incentive to do so. The age distribution of teachers has changed in important ways since 2010. As you can see in this chart, the age distribution of teachers is generally characterized by spikes caused by cohorts of new teachers entering over time to meet periods of particularly high demand. These peaks and troughs tend to fall over time due to teachers leaving the profession. The most noticeable change in recent years has been the number of teachers in their 50s falling from 23% in 2010 to 17% in 2017. Fewer and fewer teachers are making it through a full career in an increasingly demanding profession. The nature of retention has also shifted over time, away from natural replacement of retiring teachers to larger numbers of working-age teachers leaving each year. Fewer teachers retiring has offset the rise in working-age teachers leaving to some extent, but not enough to stop the overall leaving rate climbing. Teacher retention also has a regional dimension. Our research finds that London is a vibrant city and an attractive place for young teachers to train and teach. However, despite the opportunities that London's education system offers, it faces a significant and growing teacher supply challenge as it struggles to retain teachers over the longer term. London has considerably more teachers leaving the profession compared to other areas, including other large cities such as Birmingham and Manchester. While London schools attract teachers in their 20s from other areas, they lose 1% of their teachers in their 30s and 0.6% of their teachers in their 40s every year. This doesn't happen in other large urban areas and is at a time when pupil numbers are rising faster in the capital than they are elsewhere. We also looked at how the big structural change in the school landscape of the last decade, the growth of academies and multi-academy trusts, has affected the teacher workforce. Our analysis shows that MATs tend to have a slightly higher than average rate of teachers leaving the profession compared to other school types, even after accounting for the fact that a large number of schools in MATs are sponsored academies, which tend to have higher turnover rates. But we find that MAT leaders are making use of the opportunities which come from being the legal employers of all staff in their schools, redeploying teachers and senior leaders within their academy trust to where they're most needed. School-to-school staff movement within MATs tends to be slightly towards schools with more disadvantaged intakes, whereas in general, when they move school, teachers are more likely than not to move away from disadvantaged schools. As the system of MATs grows and develops in the future, the opportunities for flexible staff deployment and staff progression and development within the same organisation may lead to longer-term retention benefits. However, despite there being variation in retention patterns between teachers with different characteristics and in schools in different circumstances and regions, altogether these factors explain relatively little of the overall variation in retention. All the teacher, school and geographical characteristics from the school workforce census data that we use to estimate statistical models of retention explain just 12% of the variation. So what this means is that based just on what we know about them and their school from the school workforce census, it's impossible to predict with any degree of accuracy whether a given teacher will leave the profession in the next year. To gain the deepest insights about what drives teacher labour market behaviour, we need to know more about teachers' working conditions and about their day-to-day lives. So what factors seem to influence a teacher's decision to leave the profession? Is it a better paid job outside education? Is it a better work-life balance or improved job satisfaction? Or is it other factors? This is what we're able to explore by tracking teachers before and after they leave the profession. So we find that the pay of teachers who leave the profession and take up a new job is, on average, more than 10% less than it was when they were a teacher. Their pay does not recover over the next 4 years to the level it was in the last year before they left teaching. Also, 4 out of 5 full-time teachers say they're satisfied with their income, which is similar to the levels seen among nurses and police officers. And we also find that teacher retention rates are, in general, fairly unresponsive to the level of pay in the local area, a sort of proxy for the number and quality of available outside opportunities. All this seems to suggest that most working-age teachers' decisions to leave the profession are not primarily motivated by the prospect of higher pay. However, this does not imply that increasing teachers' pay will have no impact on retention. Following years of freezes and below-inflation increases, increasing teacher pay is likely to improve retention to some degree, and a pay increase may compensate for other factors that are driving their decision to leave. It's also the policy lever that is most within government's control, but policy responses that aim to increase teacher retention need to consider pay alongside the other factors affecting the trade-offs that teachers make, such as their workload, working hours, and their job satisfaction. The wider research evidence suggests that pay increases designed to improve teacher retention are likely to be most effective and best value for money when they are targeted at groups of teachers who are most responsive to pay differentials. These include early career teachers and teachers with subjects with well-paid alternatives outside of teaching, like science and maths teachers. The government's announced pay increase for 2018-19 of 3.5% for teachers on the main pay scale and 2% for teachers on the upper pay scale targets the increase at early career teachers. So within a constrained envelope, this would seem to be a relatively effective use of scarce resources. However, the pay increases are not differentiated by subject. Recent research by Sam Sims at the Institute of Education has argued that targeting pay increases at teachers of shortage subjects such as science and maths could have a sizable impact on their relative undersupply. And one way to target resources at this group is to make bursary payments tied to teachers staying in teaching after their training. Upfront bursaries for trainees of shortage subjects are not incentivising recruitment or retention to the levels required. In our paper in May last year, we recommended that the government should consider restructuring these financial incentives to train to explicitly incentivise retention in the teaching profession during the first few years after training. The government is piloting phased bursaries for maths teachers and student loan reimbursement for science and modern foreign language teachers. These are both promising developments that could drive improvement in early career retention rates in shortage subjects. So what about these other factors that form the pay versus working conditions trade-off that teachers face? So our analysis finds that job satisfaction is crucial to understanding teacher retention. The self-reported job satisfaction of teachers who leave teaching for another job increases considerably after they leave, which suggests that the prospect of higher job satisfaction outside teaching is an influential pull factor. Teachers' job satisfaction also declines in the years before they leave teaching, suggesting that falling job satisfaction was an important factor contributing to their decision to leave in the first place. That job satisfaction is related to retention may not be that surprising, but the differences before and after leaving that we found for teachers are much larger than they are for nurses. Previous research by us and others has identified several factors associated with job satisfaction: the quality of school leadership and management, teacher autonomy, whether teachers feel they're supported and valued by their leaders, and whether or not teachers feel their workload is manageable. This last factor, unmanageable workload, is consistently the most cited reason ex-teachers give in surveys for why they left the profession. So we find that teachers work considerably longer hours during term time than nurses and police officers work in a normal working week. It's often said that because teachers get longer holidays than other professions, this makes up for the long hours they work during term time. However, even under fairly conservative assumptions of how much teachers work during their holidays, they still work longer hours over the course of a year than nurses. Because of the peaks and troughs of the school year, teachers work more intensively across fewer weeks in the year. Teachers have the lowest satisfaction with their amount of leisure time compared to nurses and police officers. Working long hours over prolonged periods, as teachers are doing, can create stress and pressure with potential negative effects on health and well-being. According to the stakeholders we spoke to in the nursing and policing sectors, the emphasis on supporting the health and well-being of staff has increased in time as a result of the perceived increase in workload in these sectors over time. Effectively promoting teacher well-being may improve their ability to manage high workloads. However, effective action to reduce teacher workload, tackling the cause rather than the symptom, is required. Since the 2014 Workload Challenge, the DfE has been working on reducing teachers' unnecessary workload and has certainly stepped up its efforts this year. In March this year, the government launched a campaign with Ofsted and teaching and leadership unions aimed at reducing teacher workload. In May, the government established a workload advisory group to consider how to remove unnecessary workload associated with data collection and management in schools, and published a workload reduction toolkit for schools in July. These are all welcome steps in the right direction. But government and Ofsted need to continue working together to review the actions that impact their actions are having on the workload of all teachers, and to identify practical actions that can be taken to reduce it. As the Secretary of State remarked last month, the government cannot do as much as you might hope to reduce teachers' workload, end quote. School leaders do also need to regularly monitor the job satisfaction and engagement of their staff. School leaders should also use line management effectively to identify workload issues among staff and intervene to increase support and reduce workload pressures where issues are identified. One of the seemingly counterintuitive things about teacher workload is that teachers who work the longest hours are those most likely to stay in the profession. However, it's the extent to which workload becomes unmanageable that affects retention. Teachers who are unable or unwilling to work long hours to keep up with the high workload find their workload becomes unmanageable and are more likely to leave the profession. Another factor we identified as being important for teacher retention is part-time and flexible working. As Laura has written about, the prospect of large numbers of full-time teachers moving to part-time work on its own presents a risk to teacher supply in the short term. However, we see three main reasons why more and better part-time work and flexible working is important for improving teacher retention in the longer term. Number one, there is unmet demand for part-time working in the secondary sector, which drives some teachers to leave. The proportion of secondary teachers working part-time has increased from 17% in 2010 to 19% in 2017. However, primary schools have a significantly higher proportion of part-time teachers compared to secondary schools at 27% in 2017. Part of the primary-secondary gap is explained by there being more female teachers in primary schools, more of whom work part-time across both sectors. However, as you can see here, a big part of this gap persists even after accounting for differences in the gender and age distribution. This suggests that there is unmet demand for part-time working among secondary school teachers in particular. Our research also finds that many secondary teachers who leave teaching for another job switch from full-time to part-time work. Among secondary teachers who leave for another job, the proportion working part-time rises by 20 percentage points after leaving, which suggests that this unmet demand for part-time work is partly driving some secondary teachers to leave the profession to seek more flexible work outside. More flexible working opportunities may have encouraged some of them to stay. Number 2, part-time secondary teachers have higher rates of leaving the profession than part-time primary teachers. This suggests that secondary teachers and secondary schools have more difficulty making part-time employment work, and that part-time teachers in secondary schools find it more difficult to sustain the demands of part-time working alongside their other responsibilities. Part-time working needs to be a more sustainable option for teachers. Number 3, a lack of part-time and flexible working opportunities is one of the key barriers facing teachers on career breaks who want to return. Not only is the relative inflexibility of secondary schools having a negative impact on leaving rates, but it's also creating a barrier to re-entry for secondary teachers who wish to return to teaching. NFER's evaluation of the return to teaching pilot identified a lack of part-time and flexible working opportunities as one of the key barriers facing teachers who wanted to return. This was particularly among teachers on a career break who face few other barriers to returning. We also find that teachers who leave and return are more likely to return to a part-time role if they return to the same school than if they return to a different school. This could reflect schools' greater willingness to accommodate part-time working arrangements for teachers they know compared to teachers they don't know. It also suggests a wider implication for teachers who want to return to teaching in a part-time role. Teachers who want to return part-time are likely to find it more difficult to secure a role. Improved availability of flexible working opportunities may reduce the number of teachers choosing to be employed flexibly through a supply agency. The NHS has identified this as an important way of potentially retaining more nurses directly in the state sector, which could also be the case for teachers. Over the longer term, teachers who would have left the profession without being able to go part-time may be more likely to return to work full-time in the future after a period of working part-time. Keeping such teachers teaching could retain their expertise and reduce the risk of losing them from the profession permanently. The secondary school teacher workforce has a large cohort of teachers approaching their mid-30s, which is when part-time employment peaks, meaning the next few years are a critical time for taking action. The government and stakeholders in the secondary sector need to look urgently at identifying ways to accommodate more and better part-time working opportunities in secondary schools. It's pleasing to see that the part-time and flexible working seems to be emerging as one of the key themes of the DfE's recruitment and retention strategy. NFER research has shown that the complexity of secondary school timetabling is perceived by senior leaders as the key reason why part-time teaching is more difficult to accommodate in secondary schools than in primary. However, attitudes and cultures in some schools may mean that flexible opportunities are not as widespread as teachers would hope. While school leaders need to find ways of accommodating greater flexibility, teachers who would like to work part-time also need to respect the challenge that school leaders face of ensuring the school is fully staffed at all times. For example, not all part-time teachers can work a 4-day week with Fridays off. Teachers being flexible on what arrangements they are willing to accept would make the task of senior leaders who are open to accommodating flexible arrangements far easier. But some of the unmet demand for part-time working may represent full-time teachers finding their workload unmanageable and wanting to reduce it. So, for example, teachers may prefer to teach 3 or 4 days a week with a day or two for marking and planning, which would otherwise be done at evenings and weekends, even if it involves a reduced pay. Therefore, a strategy for improving opportunities for part-time working will be most effective alongside a strategy for reducing teachers' workload. Making the job of a full-time teacher sustainable for teachers with children or other caring responsibilities could really help to improve the retention of full-time staff who leave because of their unmanageable workload. We are very pleased to see that one of the main outcomes of all of NFER's work in this area, and of this research project in particular, has been to raise the profile of teacher retention as an important issue that deserves the attention of policymakers. According to the departmental plan, the DfE's number one priority in schools policy is to deliver the recruitment and retention strategy. It is great to see that the DfE is treating the issue of teacher supply with the urgency it deserves, and for retention to be seen as just as important as recruitment. We have made recommendations throughout this project of areas where focused policy attention to improve teacher retention is likely to be most fruitful. These have included restructuring bursaries for shortage subjects to incentivize retention and not just recruitment, action to improve part-time and flexible working opportunities in secondary schools, and also action to reduce teachers' workload. It is promising that all three seem to be being considered as part of the DfE's ongoing recruitment and retention strategy. However, all three require action now that will hopefully pay off in terms of improved retention over the medium to long term once policy changes take effect within the system. Returning to the opening slide, it's clear that the perfect storm that's been gathering for several years of rising pupil numbers, below target recruitment, and increasing numbers of teachers leaving the profession is hitting right now. Teacher shortages will increasingly affect schools now and over the next few years, particularly in shortage subjects and schools in disadvantaged areas, and is likely to have direct impacts on pupils' education. School leaders are the first to be feeling the effects of teacher shortages on the ground. But school leaders are also those with the most direct influence over teachers' working conditions. Heads can be the change they want to see, focusing on staff engagement and satisfaction now, and keep high-quality teachers in the profession for the benefit of the system, but also their school. To improve teacher retention, nurturing, supporting, and valuing teachers is vital to keep their engagement high. Making teaching a sustainable career is one of the keys to the future of England's education system, and one that both school leaders and the government have an important role to play in delivering. When they leave, well over half of our working-age teachers remain working in the education system more widely. They are committed to improving outcomes for children and young people. Let's encourage more of them to stay and offer those who have left the prospect of an exciting, rewarding, and manageable career that they want to return to. In doing so, we'll make it a profession that new recruits also want to be a part of.
For more on NFER's research and recommendations on teacher retention and recruitment, visit www.nfer.ac.uk/school-workforce.